have resorted to suicide, and it's been quite a bit written about it because they just can't cope with it all, which hints at the complexities and consequences of policies that challenge power and privilege and the potential problems at other levels of schooling also, which is one might research is useful, I hope. So affirmative action in private education institutes outside higher education was very limited in India until the RTE. Previously, the affirmative action practices were largely left to the discretion of the school, in keeping with private schools' independence from the state. So the imposition of this provision indicates a change in direction because it's an obligation forced on the private schools by the government, not an autonomous choice of the schools. And Anna Howard suggests that actions like these are an affront to their sense of agency in constructing their identity. It also challenges these schools' sense of sovereignty, power and influence by state intrusion in the imposition of education as a shared responsibility of private schools with the state, rather than a business choice. Aside from RTE, the elite schools in India make a show of engaging with affirmative action discourse, displaying acts of generosity and benevolence in much the same ways as elite schools in other places and at other times. From a history of, which moves on to the charity servicing, from a history of an aristocratic moral sense of responsibility for the lower orders, elite schools see themselves as generous benefactors. The literature shows that their altruistic performances serve the interests of the schools and are intended to diminish perceptions of disproportionate wealth and advantage, with evidence of a social conscience and humility, and display membership of the global alliance of enlightened elites. This sense of generosity is communicated to students via service programs. International educational affiliations like Round Square give elite students opportunities to build their global elite networks while they engage in educational tourism. Local acts of charity don't just avert criticism and enhance legitimacy of elite schooling and therefore students, they also contribute to the neoliberal agenda of transferring responsibility and expenditure for welfare services from the state to civil society. Or service might be part of the curriculum, such as the IB's component of CAS, which is creativity, activity and creativity, action and service. Thank you, everyone knows. So CAS is often considered of lesser importance than the other subject areas, and students widely use CAS as a means to bolster their university applications. Because of this, it falls, be accused of being falling short of its aims to promote intercultural understandings and other learner profile outcomes. And there's literature that talks about this shows that just as the school's generosity is bounded by self-interest, so too is the students. And although some students acknowledge their social responsibilities as future leaders, an understanding of a concern about underlying systemic problems is rarely shown. Instead, there's a strong sense that their status quo is underwritten rather than challenged. Schools don't invite students to critically unpack their service activities relative to themselves, those with whom they interact, or the relationship between both parties. Such practices of service and charity are all practices done by elite school students, done to or perhaps for less privileged people. They are performed according to elite agendas. It's neither an impression nor an intention of doing with. Because of this power differential, this not doing with, elite formations are not threatened. Also because the practices are under the school's control, their autonomy and authority remains intact, in keeping with their status quo as elite institutions. These power relations, reinforced through service, ensure the possibilities for elite school students' relationships with those less privileged remain hierarchical, paternalistic and egocentric. So this is the context then in which elite schools formulate their responses to equity discourses and policies. And these responses of segregation and polarisation, disavowal and obfuscation, protection and rejection, affectation and deflection are shown in the literature as occurring in elite schools around the world. Yet there's a scarcity of research dedicated to a real depth of investigation of their responses. I'll quickly mention one study that does engage analytically with the discourse of equality in an elite school in India and adds appropriation to these responses. Shri Prakash, Chi and Singh pick up the service thread that I was just talking about then in their examination of the different ways equality is used. They propose that particular discourse of equality are strategically used in class-making practices in one school they studied. Indian Academy, which is a pseudonym and was an elite international school, and it established an outreach school for local disadvantaged children next to its main campus. This outreach school is referred to as the Equal Opportunity School. As well as having separate buildings, the outreach school has separate teachers. Indian Academy students undertake their service for the IB at this school. Indian Academy has translated outreach as the provision of education rights. And while some at the elite school associate the outreach school with RTE, the authors don't suggest that they're explicitly related, but it's going to have an impact on how they perceive RTE nonetheless. So these authors propose that rather than outreach as fulfilment of education rights, the outreach school typifies exclusion from and closure by elite sectors, and the elite Indian Academy's conditional enactment of education rights is shrouded by the talk of equality. The authors conceptualise enterprise equality as a mode of class formations for the new globally oriented elite. I just realised that it's not very good contrast there. Anyway, by which inequality is normalised and justified in line with contemporary national cultures of neoliberalism. The first key component of enterprise equality is that it's for profit. That is, it benefits the elite and is a means of constituting desired elite subjectivities. Through service, the authors say, student self-development is conflated with transnational leadership as they are moulded into ideal citizens of the neoliberal state. The second component is the deferral of equality. So social change has to wait until the students have established their careers and locked in their privilege. Once this is achieved, it'll allow them the freedom to help, perhaps by employing outreach school graduates in the companies they head in an unchanged political economy. Thus, deferral projects beyond the foreseeable, and in the meantime, the status quo for the advantage and the disadvantage is retained under a fantasy of future equality. And the final component in this model is differential inclusion, by which the elite determine who gets included in equality for-profit projects. And doing it this way, the elite maintain control of the socio-economic playing field. This is achieved by both physical and social boundaries that are manipulated through service work and rests on assumption of inferiority of the other. Okay. So enterprise equality hides conditions of inequality so that when the elite emerge as the winners in class formation struggles, our advantageous positions are easily perceived as deserved and meritorious, despite the fact the game has been played by our own rules. So I thought this encapsulates the state of elite schools' relationships with equality as this literature I've introduced today mentions. I'm nearly done. So this school's, Indian Academy School's interpretation of mechanisms of equality leads to my conceptual standpoint of social justice. Using transformative understandings of social justice and incorporating theorists, participants and contextual understandings, I'm hoping to explore how these might inform an elite school's mediation of an equity policy. So a situation where elites as a group identity promote the merits and values of individualism in contemporary global neoliberalist ideologies and performances against an historical cultural background that social collectivism, while grappling with discourses and policies of equity and equality, is without doubt complicated. And as Andre Bataille, an Indian sociologist, points out, the recency of India's constitution, compared to when most Western or developed, Western nation states were established, means that values of equality were recognised constitutionally in India in a climate of widespread endorsement of the principles of equality as a right, and notional support for equal opportunity and affirmative actions as measures to administer such rights, which is really quite different to many other places. So this is the influence under which the school's responses to equity policies and discourses are made. And I put that quote there for Bataille, who says that whatever people may say or even believe about equality as a general principle, they are socially and even morally committed to specific practices in which different forms of inequality are embedded. Iris Marion Young posits that such participation in institutional processes or practices that produce structural injustice imposes a shared responsibility and therefore an obligation on individuals for creating socially just relationships with each other. Obligations that can be relieved through social institutions, such as schools, as instruments or channels that both enable action and constrain it. And Nancy Fraser's conceptualisation of justice through the dimensions of redistribution, recognition and representation also offers an interesting framework for analysing elite schooling and equity. So these different, as previously, but interrelated perspectives have inspired me to work with a range, looking at different understandings of social justice in this project. So taking into account the socio-political environment of India's independence invites an exploration of the conceptual history of social justice while also provincialising the concept itself. By examining how social justice is conceived and enacted by those implementing the RTE provision at Ripon College, along with reading how social justice is represented in the policy itself and what the public discourse is around social justice at this particular time period, I'm hoping to gain insight into the relationship between elite schools' understanding of social justice and the way equity agendas are interpreted and negotiated. In turn, I'm hoping this will contribute knowledge to of how the formation of elite identities and cultures is affected by the school's engagement with the equity policies and discourses. At the same time, how the analytical concept of social justice has travelled and what work it does, as determined by probing the interpretations, experiences and actions of participants in this case study, media representations and policy documents, will contribute to the formation of the concept contribute to the transformation of the concept from perhaps either Australian or European understandings to allow for the understandings of this set of contemporary Indians. That's why I'm looking at social justice. And I'm done. Thank you very much.
So let's open it up for questions, elaboration, comments.